He boarded the plane under a fake name, carrying a briefcase filled with wires and a chilling demand. DB. Cooper. The man who vanished into legend and left law enforcement chasing shadows for over 5 decades. No one knew who he really was, until now. For 54 years, DB. Cooper remained America's most elusive mystery, a phantom hijacker who outwitted the FBI, captivated the public, and inspired countless conspiracy theories. But today, that ghost finally has a name. So, who was DB? Cooper? Some call him a folk hero, others, a cunning thief. To me, he was nothing more than a sleazy, cold-blooded criminal. The truth has finally started to surface, thanks to a mysterious parachute, decades of detective work, and one relentless investigator who refused to let the case go cold. Every clue now points to a single man, and the legend is crumbling fast. But before we reveal the truth, let's rewind to where it all began. Thanksgiving Eve, 1971. The airport buzzed with holiday traveler, eager to get home. Flight 305, a routine 30-minute hop from Portland to Seattle, seemed completely ordinary. But somewhere between row 18 and the cockpit, a man in a black suit, a clip-on tie, and dark sunglasses was about to rewrite American criminal history. He gave his name as Dan Cooper, just another face in the crowd. Except he wasn't. What happened next would become the stuff of legend. And for half a century, no one could say how he pulled it off, or who he really was, until now. But halfway through that short ride, something happened that no one on board could have predicted. Cooper, calm as ever, passed a handwritten note to the flight attendant. She smiled politely, thinking it was just another lonely guy giving her his number. She tucked it away in her pocket. That's when Cooper leaned in close and whispered something that changed American aviation history forever. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." In that minute, she froze. Cooper had laid out his demands in the note. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting on the runway in Seattle. And if he didn't get it, he'd blow the whole plane sky high. And it didn't seem like he was bluffing, because when the flight attendant hesitated, he popped open the briefcase just enough to reveal what looked like dynamite sticks wired to a battery pack. The flight attendant appeared calm as she nodded and casually walked up to the cockpit, like she was just doing her usual rounds. She slipped into the cockpit and informed the pilot, William Scott, who immediately looped in the co-pilot and the flight engineer. At this point, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Was this guy ex-military? Was the bomb real? Was this some kind of political stunt? From there, the pilot radioed in a hijacking code to air traffic control. That set off alarms on the ground, and within minutes, the FBI was notified. This was now a federal case. By the time Flight 305 landed in Seattle, the FBI had scrambled into action. The passengers were safely let off the plane, completely unaware they'd just been part of what would become the most legendary hijacking in mere American history. The cash was delivered, the parachutes handed over, and with only a skeleton crew on board, the plane took off again under Cooper's instructions, heading south toward Mexico. Then, somewhere over the dense forests of Washington state, while rain whipped across the aircraft and the winds howled at 200 miles an hour, DB. Cooper opened the rear stairs of the jet and jumped at around 8 p.m. And just like that, he was gone. One moment, DB. Cooper was in seat 18C, and the next, he was falling through 10,000 feet of pitch-black sky with a bag full of money strapped to his chest, and nothing but the night to catch him. But what he didn't know was that before he jumped, he left his clip-on tie that he took off. The crew landed the plane in Reno empty-handed. Cooper had jumped somewhere over the thick pine forest near the Washougal River in southwestern Washington, and the FBI had no idea where to begin. By morning, the search was in full swing. Hundreds of agents, state troopers, paratroopers, helicopters, bloodhounds. They combed every inch of forest they could find. They scoured riverbanks and small towns, but there wasn't so much as a boot print, not a shred of fabric. Not even a broken twig they could trace back to him. It was like the man had melted into the trees. And to make matters worse, the media got one crucial detail wrong, which was his alias. The name on his boarding pass was Dan Cooper. But when the story made the media rounds, there was a mistake with the hijacker's name. And just like that, Dan became D, B, and DB. Cooper stuck like glue. The FBI chased down every tip they got. Over 1,000 suspects were investigated. One man even confessed on his deathbed. But it turned out he was just lonely and wanted attention. None of the DNA collected, none of the handwriting samples, and not even the ransom bills turned up any solid leads. Well, except for one. An innocent camp trip turned out to be a turning point for the FBI, as a solid lead finally became one of the reasons to reopen the case nearly a decade later. After 9 years, when the drama had cooled off a bit, an 8-year-old boy camping with his family found something strange buried in the sand along the Columbia River. It was 3 bundles of $20 bills, rotted and sun-damaged, but still bound in rubber bands. They thought it was odd and alerted the police. And after a series of investigations, the FBI got into the case and confirmed that the serial numbers on the bills were a perfect match to the one packed in the bag of the guy that they had painfully searched for. This was a lead, and probably it was enough to reopen the case. It was the first and only physical clue Cooper left behind, and it raised more questions than it answered. Did he die in the fall and the money washed downstream? Or did he plant it there just to mess with the feds? The FBI, still persistent, ramped up the investigation again. The teams searched the Tina Bar area. Divers scoured the Columbia River, and forensic analysts examined the money for clues. But after all that, they had nothing. No parachute, no gear, no body. There were no traces of Cooper. Just 3 crusty bundles of 20s found by a little boy, and thousands of new, unanswered questions. Despite that, the case remained technically open. For decades, the FBI kept it on the books as an active but cold case. But by 2016, the FBI had exhausted every angle and finally decided to officially close the case after 45 years, shelving it as one of the greatest unsolved crimes in American history. But while the trail may have gone cold, somewhere out there, someone was about to blow it wide open. The breakthrough no one saw coming. While the feds had been digging through and through looking for clues that could finally reveal or lead them to who DB Cooper really was. Another guy behind the scenes was also doing his own investigation. Dan Grider, a retired commercial airline captain with over 24,000 flight hours under his belt, is a YouTuber with a channel on which he talks about flying an aircraft and all that good stuff. It was no surprise to know he took an interest in the DB Cooper case, and for some reason, he just couldn't let it go, even after the FBI had given up on it. He spent years studying flight log, terrain maps, wind speeds, and FBI files most people didn't even know existed. He recreated jump scenarios, dissected parachute models, and went over every last detail of Cooper's escape. Not for clicks, not for fame, but because he genuinely believed he could solve it. And in 2023, more than 50 years after the infamous skyjacking, Dan stumbled into something that would make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Dan followed a hunch to a dusty storage unit in Utah. The unit had once belonged to a woman with ties to the family of Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a name that had floated in DB Cooper circles for years, but had never quite stuck. Most thought it was just another dead end. But Dan had found something. This was going to change the trajectory of what the FBI, the whole country, and even Dan thought he knew about Cooper. Inside that forgotten unit, buried beneath boxes of books and memorabilia, Dan found a parachute, and not just any parachute. It just fit the same description as the one Cooper had requested. This rig was old, military style, with peculiar modifications that matched specific details from FBI files dating back to 1971. But it was where the parachute came from that sent chills down Dan's spine. The unit had a direct link to McCoy, the man who, just 5 months after Cooper's vanishing act, hijacked a plane using the exact same playbook. That's when Dan knew the two events weren't a coincidence. This parachute was the one object that tied 2 unsolved crimes together with shocking precision. And suddenly, McCoy wasn't just a footnote anymore. He was the frontrunner. Because if that parachute belonged to Cooper, and it came from McCoy, then maybe, just maybe, they were the same man all along. What Dan found next wasn't just another clue. It was a buried truth, hidden in plain sight, with the power to rewrite everything we thought we knew about the most legendary mystery in American history. But the main piece hidden in sight that was crucial for everyone was to find out exactly who Richard McCoy was. Who was he? And why does he keep coming up in odd places in the DB? Cooper case? Richard McCoy, Jr. If you wrote down Richard McCoy, Jr. is resumed without context, you'd probably think he was straight out of a patriotic Hallmark movie. Born and raised in Utah, McCoy was a devout Mormon, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, and a helicopter pilot who flew into combat zones and made it back home intact. He was also a family man, as he was married with kids, and at the time of his arrest, he was working toward a law degree at Brigham Young University. His neighbors described him as polite, quiet, and deeply religious. To everyone around him, McCoy looked like the American dream wrapped in a clean-cut uniform. Behind that perfect image was something no one expected. Because 5 months after DB, Cooper vanished into legend. McCoy did the exact same thing, but this time, it was louder. It happened on April 7, 1972. McCoy boarded United Airlines Flight 855 in Denver, carrying a briefcase and dressed in a business suit. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. Just like Cooper. He handed a note to a flight attendant and calmly informed her that he had a bomb. Then came the demands of $500,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a refueled plane ready to head to San Francisco. Sound familiar? McCoy executed the plan like he'd studied it line by line. After the ransom was delivered, he ordered the pilots to take off again, and somewhere over Utah, just like the ghost before him. He jumped. The FBI was stunned. It was déjà vu, but with more money, more precision, and one big difference. This time, they got him. McCoy made one big mistake. Actually, 2. First, he left behind a handwritten note in the cockpit, the kind of thing that doesn't scream professional. And second, his fingerprints showed up on an in-flight glass of water. The FBI matched those prints back to McCoy within days. They tracked him down at home in Provo, Utah, where he was just at home with his family like nothing had happened. When he got arrested, the questions came running in. Why would a man like that, a soldier, a husband, a student, risk everything for a crime so bold and dangerous? And why did his hijacking look like a carbon copy of the Cooper case? The eerie similarities sent chills through investigators. The same type of Boeing 727, the same rear stairwell parachute escape, the same calm demeanor, the same note passing. Even the phrasing in both hijacked notes had uncanny overlaps. It didn't just look similar. It came off as scripted. This got many people wondering if this guy was just a copycat of the original guy, DB, Cooper. But what if Richard McCoy didn't just copy DB? Cooper's style? What if he was DB? Cooper all along? That question would haunt investigators, fuel conspiracy theories, and divide experts for decades. And if you think it all ends with McCoy in handcuffs, well, you might want to rethink. When Richard McCoy was arrested, you'd think the FBI would have connected the dots immediately. 2 hijackings, 5 months apart, nearly identical in style, tone, and execution. So, of course, it felt like they were executed by the same person. But surprisingly, the Bureau shut that theory down fast. Officially, they claimed McCoy couldn't have been DB. Cooper because they had different motives, different facial features, and, most of all, a totally different physical description from the witnesses. The witnesses from the Cooper case described a man in his mid-40s with dark hair and olive skin. McCoy was 29, clean-cut, and fair-skinned with lighter hair. And while Cooper was wearing a suit and sunglasses, McCoy's look on the day of his heist was more business casual, more relaxed. Not to mention the notes they passed, which had slightly different wordings, and not to also the different handwriting. The FBI leaned hard into those differences and walked away convinced that McCoy was a copycat, not the original. But that might have just been a big mistake, because as we go into details of what was discovered, it just might be revealed that these differences might have just been a deliberate act to mislead or manipulate the feds. Think about it. McCoy was trained in military strategy. He knew how to operate under pressure and how to plan a mission down to the smallest detail. If he was Cooper, wouldn't it make sense to switch up his appearance? Age himself up the first time around, then look completely different the next? And the note? The altered language? The change in handwriting? I mean, come on. Anyone can change their handwriting if they want to. That might have been part of the plan. A way to throw off law enforcement just enough to stay one step ahead. The more Dan Grider looked at the evidence, the more these differences started to look like camouflage. In simple terms, tactics. And that's when the whole thing got personal. Because this wasn't just about a man and a parachute anymore. And it didn't just look like it was just McCoy hiding something. Now, it was his family. The people who had lived for years under a cloud of silence. It appears that they knew more than they ever let on, as they might have been protecting a secret so heavy, it shaped every part of their lives. Dan's investigation had stirred up something deeper than just cold facts and old photos. And now, this is where the truth is uncovered. McCoy family secrets. To the world, Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. was a war hero, a man of faith, a loving father, and a doting husband. But behind closed doors, within the tight walls of his home in Utah, a different tension quietly pulsed. Not one of fear or confession, but one of silence. And silence, as we've learned in stories like this, doesn't always mean there's nothing to say. After successfully hijacking Flight 885 and being caught, Richard McCoy was sentenced to 45 years imprisonment. But 2 years later, he and some other inmates at the Pennsylvania Penitentiary planned an escape and eventually got in a garbage truck and took off. However, luck ran out 3 months later, and they were tracked down. Somehow, Richard got hold of a gun and started firing, which led to a shootout between him and FBI agents, leading to his death in 1974. So it was a crazy thought to think that the parachute that was allegedly used by DB Cooper could have been the same one in Richard's storage. Dan Grider knew that, and once he found the parachute buried deep in a storage unit linked to McCoy's family, he didn't just want answers, so he started reaching out, first to McCoy's children. Emails, letters, messages passed through mutual contacts, but the response was always the same. Nothing. Not a word. Not even a polite no. Just silence. At first, Grider thought it was resistance, but over time, he realized it wasn't anger or denial. It felt like they were trying to protect something. These weren't people trying to hide the truth from the world. They were trying to shield themselves from what it might do to them if it ever came out. And just when it seemed like this mystery was as human as it could get, Grider made one more discovery. It wasn't just the family hiding something. There was something else. Something buried not in a file, not in a headline, but in a closet. Somewhere in the dusty attic of a grandmother's house in Provo, Utah. A box was pulled from the back of a closet. Tucked behind Christmas ornaments and yellowed photo albums was something that didn't belong. A canvas bundle. Old, weathered, tied shut with care. At first, no one thought much of it. Just an old parachute. Maybe their grandfather's? But Dan Grider knew better. When he laid it out and examined the seams, his hands shook. Not because of age or excitement, but because he recognized it. It had the same straps, the same faded stitching, and the same weird rigging, the kind the FBI had quietly noted back in 1971, locked away in reports few had ever seen. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a match. And that changed everything. This chute wasn't just old. It wasn't common. It was more military style, but modified. A detail only someone with deep knowledge of skydiving would have known how to do. And Richard McCoy wasn't just familiar with parachutes. He had a thing for them. He taught skydiving and made his own jumps by the hundreds. The man could have packed a chute blindfolded in a thunderstorm. But here's the twist. This parachute wasn't lost. It was hidden very carefully and deliberately, as if they knew one day that someone might come looking. Grider brought the chute to experts. They confirmed the modifications matched those listed in the FBI's 1971 files. Same unusual harness clips, same reinforced cord loops. It wasn't proof, at least not legally, but it was strong and strange evidence, one that was impossible to ignore. So if McCoy had the parachute, if the rig matched the infamous DB, Cooper jump, and if his own family had kept it boxed away all these years, what did that say? The answer wasn't just hiding in a closet. And suddenly, the line between myth and man grew razor thin. But here's where things took an even stranger turn. Because just as Grider started piecing together McCoy's past, something else surfaced. A confession. Not written, not recorded, but handed down face to face. One relative, one night, one conversation that flipped everything on its head. But before getting into that, the FBI had to come into the case once again, as allegations made by Dan were too sensitive, and they needed to see the truth for themselves. The FBI returns to the case. After decades of silence, the FBI was about to make its return to the DB Cooper case. All it took was a viral video made by Dan to get them back on track. His findings, specifically the parachute, tucked away in a dusty Utah storage unit, were too significant to ignore. The FBI's response was swift. They couldn't afford to let this moment pass. Grider's videos had created a storm of media buzz and online speculation. And it was all tied back to a piece of the puzzle that hadn't been considered for decades. The parachute wasn't just an old relic. It was something that connected a critical piece of the mystery. But this wasn't a simple case of someone just handing over evidence. No, this was bigger. The parachute had unique features. The same modifications the FBI had documented back in 1971. Features that had never been linked to any other hijacking at the time. The Bureau had to act and act fast. As Grider's discovery sent ripples through the investigative world, the FBI sent agents to retrieve the parachute from Grider's hands. It was packed carefully and shipped off to Quantico, where all their forensic efforts would take place. Remember that Ty Cooper left behind in the plane? The one that had been neglected for so many years? Well, the FBI had analyzed it in the past, but they only found partial DNA samples. The idea had always been to find a match, but they never had a good enough lead until now. The parachute wasn't just a piece of the puzzle. It was the potential final piece. Now, the plan was to exhume Richard's body, to take the DNA samples to match with any particular evidence that was left behind, like the parachute or his tie with samples taken from McCoy's children. Something that could either confirm or finally debunk the theory that McCoy was DB, Cooper. But no one knows how that plan went. As the agents carried the parachute to the lab, the tension in the air was palpable. This was no longer a cold case. It was a race against time. The FBI had waited 54 years for evidence like this, and now it was now or never. And as the FBI prepped their labs and the tests began, all eyes were on the one question that remained unanswered. Was Richard McCoy Jr. really DB Cooper? The confession. The truth was always closer than anyone realized. But it took a relentless obsession from the right person to finally bring it to light. Dan Grider had spent years chasing shadows. But he didn't stop when the parachute surfaced. He knew he was on to something. And now it was time to push even harder. After all, the biggest question in the DB Cooper mystery had always been the identity of the man behind the crime. Grider believed the key to answering that question wasn't hidden in a file. Rather, it was buried in the hearts of McCoy's family. Shante and Rick McCoy III, Richard McCoy's children, had been living with the weight of a secret for their entire lives. The story of their father had always been kept under wraps. For years, they denied the rumors that had swirled about their dad being DB Cooper. But Dan Grider wasn't going to let the whispers remain just that. It wasn't easy to get through to them. They had refused to speak to anyone for years, scared of the media circus and the burden that would come with such a revelation. But Grider, relentless as always, found a way. He didn't come with accusations. Instead, he came with a simple truth. The pieces are too many. The world is about to know. You don't have to hide anymore. It took weeks of phone calls, emails, and back-and-forth conversations before they finally agreed to sit down. Grider was cautious, and he wasn't trying to put them in the spotlight. He just wanted the truth. And when it came in the quietest of ways, especially because it was Rick McCoy III who revealed the shocking truth. We never wanted to believe it, Rick admitted, his voice shaking with emotion. But the more we looked at everything, it's all there. He was Cooper. He had to be. Yeah, we always kind of knew it was him. One of the reasons why they also decided to speak on it was also because their mom had passed. So it was only right to speak on it. Because if they had done that while she was still alive, she might have been implicated somehow. It was an earth-shattering confession, one that immediately sent shockwaves through the online world. Within hours, Grider's video went viral. The confession of McCoy's children was the confirmation that millions had been waiting for, and while some were quick to dismiss it, the weight of the moment couldn't be ignored. After decades of speculation, the family had spoken. The legendary hijacker, D.B. Cooper, wasn't a ghost anymore. He had a name, and that name was Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. Finally, with a face behind the mystery, and a shadow that slipped through the cracks of American law enforcement. The thought of Richard McCoy being the missing puzzle of one of America's unsolved cases that gave the feds sleepless nights for years is just insane. And the fact that he was just like any other man with a family to care for makes it all interesting. Was the hijacking a thrill or a statement? Or was it his own way of wresting back power from a world that chewed him up and spat him out? Some psychologists say the Cooper hijacking wasn't just a crime. It was a cry for control in a chaotic world. And maybe that's what makes the truth harder to swallow. In the end, the face behind the legend didn't belong to a ghost. It belonged to Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a man who wanted more than money and freedom. And, in his own twisted way, took it. But is it still a legend if the man behind it was just human? As more evidence surfaces and Grider's investigation continues to gain momentum, the world is slowly piecing together not just the actions of Richard McCoy, but the man himself, his motives, his flaws, and the quiet desperation that may have driven him. The hijacking wasn't a perfect crime. It was reckless, bold, and doomed from the start. Yet somehow, it captured the imagination of an entire country. In a time when Americans were grappling with distrust in government and chaos overseas, the legend of D.B. Cooper offered something strangely comforting. A mystery that defied the system. A man who vanished without a trace. Now, that mystery has a heartbeat again. For Shantae and Rick, the decision to speak up wasn't about legacy. It was about peace, about letting go of something they didn't ask to carry. And for Dan Grider, it was about finally honoring the pursuit of truth, no matter how strange or painful it turned out to be. The D.B. Cooper case may now be solved in the eyes of many, but like all great mystery, its echoes will remain, because even if we know his name, we'll always wonder, what else did McCoy get away with? And how many secrets still lie buried, waiting to be unearthed? Let me know what you think in the comments. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. For more content like this, click on the next video on your screen.